So for the first presentation of the day, we have Timothy St. Pierre with Ne pour un petit pain, a class analysis of Maine's Franco-Americans. Oh, you can just tell me
okay.
When.
I love it. Love this talk.
All right.
All right. Sounds good. Sounds good. Take this off. Absolument, je suis bien content d'être ici avec vous. Truly, I'm really so excited to be here. It's tremendous that this is happening, and to be here in community with everyone else. It's really special. I also tried to go through this quickly because when I was going through it, I definitely did run a little bit over 15 minutes. So I will be rapid firing on through. But yeah, without further ado, hello, Timothy St. Pierre. This was my thesis for my French major from Swarthmore College. I graduated this past June. And it is, as you can see, titled Ne pour un petit pain, a class analysis of Maine's Franco-Americans. And so to begin, I can go on down the slide. I would like to start just with this little snapshot from this one book. The book is called Profiles of Maine. It was published in 1976 by a local journalist and photographer named Lynn Franklin. Is not necessarily a well-known book. I would not really expect anyone to know it. I didn't know it, but I stumbled across it in a mill. And then the former mill in Brunswick, which is now in a tea hall. However, I thought it was so interesting just because throughout this book there are dozens of different portraits of Maine people, and they are so culturally varied, they're so geographically varied, and it really does do a very nice job of showcasing all kinds of different people who live in Maine. However, in the book, out of these dozens, there is one single entry that explicitly deals with a French Canadian or Franco-American, who is, as you can see, Julien Cloutier right there, despite the fact that we are 20% to 25% of the state as a whole. And so that made me think, what was it about Julien Cloutier that specifically made Lynn Franklin, the Print journalist, put this together, select Julien Cloutier as what was essentially the de facto representation for all of Franco-America in the state of Maine. And so if we look at the story that she tells about Julien Cloutier, we see, you can't read it, I'm sorry, but his story that he's talking about how his family, his parents came down to Canada, who actually walked from Quebec to Maine, which is formidable. But he's also talking about how poor they were, his attachment to the labor movement, his attachment to unions and syndicalism. At the time he was interviewed, he was actually the president of the Textile Worker Union at the Bates Mill in Lewiston. He's talking about, again, his struggles with socioeconomic mobility in the state and his admiration for FDR and how he gave people the working man a chance and that whole thing. And so that made me think, we can go to the next slide, why was he selected? And the answer that I came to is that even though it may seem like this is a stereotype of Maine's Franco-Americans, and it is to some extent, there is such a, there are of course Franco-Americans who did achieve socioeconomic mobility, became wealthy, who entered into positions of power. But as a collective group, historically at least, we were, and to an extent still are, defined by a low rate of socioeconomic mobility, by intergenerational poverty, by this initial poverty in Canada that was further solidified in the States through 80+ years of extremely low paying, low status work, primarily in the mills and factories. So we want to go on to the next slide. And so that brings me to the title of this presentation, which is Ne pour un petit pain, which is an expression in French Canada and Franco-America, which literally means born for a little loaf of bread, born for a bun, born for just a small bit of life, is what it symbolically means, that we do not have much, we should not expect much, we are not going to attain much in our lives because that's just our lot, that's just who we are. And what it is either inadvertently or not, it is implicit commentary and recognition of the prevalence of intergenerational poverty, at least historically, among French Canadians and Franco-Americans. Next slide. And so historically it's true, but is it still true? And that was a question I really do want to answer, and to see if it is true still, or if it isn't true now, why and how did that happen? And the answer that I came to is, obviously it's no longer 1870 when Franco-Americans, French Canadians first started immigrating here. However, even though we have been here for 150 years, we've had generations of parents and children born and die in this country, it is still true to an extent. And so as a great illustration of this, we can look to what was probably the most recent large-scale study of Franco-Americans in Maine, put on by the Franco-American Center, as well as the government of Maine, which was the 2013 Contemporary Attitudes of Maine's Franco-Americans. And just some quick data points that are very telling, at least. We found, or the study found, that only 20% of Francos in the state had a bachelor's degree, let alone an advanced degree, as opposed to 37% of the rest of the state as a whole, which is almost twice as many. As you can see, twice as many Francos are uninsured, lacking, at least in 2013. 16%, twice as many Francos lacked medical insurance as opposed to the rest of the state, which is only 8% today. 35% of Francos who answered the survey had a household income, not even a personal income, but a household income of less than $20,000 per year, which is a third of the state's average household income today. And then 30% of the people answering did not want to give an answer, so it's unsure how many more also belong to the working class or had little to begin with, let alone get to the middle class. Next slide, please. And so that answer brings up the question, why is that still a problem? Why is this still an issue, even if it's not necessarily something that's visible or talked about that much? Why is it that a population that is between a fifth to a fourth of the state is still characterized by, to at least some extent, intergenerational poverty, even if it's not as drastic or as horrific as it was in sort of industrial dystopia that was, the turn of the century, with unregulated labor and very exploitative conditions. Yes. And so to answer this, I won't spend too much time on this slide, but we have to go all the way back, because I thought it was important to go all the way back to the beginning of Franco immigration from Canada, from Quebec to New England, what was called La Grande Hémorragie at the time, the Great Hemorrhage, in which nearly a million French Canadians left the country, went out through Francophones in Canada, left the country, and over 100,000 of which eventually settled in Maine. So some nice photos right here, kind of characteristic of Franco life in Canada, very religious, very rural, large families, importance of family, very agricultural. And so by and large, comes down to economics, comes down to poverty, comes back down to a desire to make something more with people's lives than they were able to at the time in Canada. And so why was that an issue? Overwhelmingly, French Canadians were a rural population, a very low income population. 80+% live in municipalities of less than 1,000 persons. Very large families were common, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, even 12 children were not even uncommon necessarily, even if they were not average. And at the same time that this Grande Hémorragie happened to take place, there was this very acute population pressure on these relatively infertile farms in rural Quebec, in which these large families, between each child, or it was each son, each heir to the family, the land would be divided between each member of the family would inherit that land, meaning that each generation of the family, each person who was inheriting land, possessed a smaller piece, a smaller parcel farm, was able to get less and less out of the land, despite the fact they kept having relatively the same rates of children, which led to indebtedness to try and increase the yields on the farm. However, there's a lack of credit, capital, or investment in these same areas. There's a lack of financial infrastructure that was available to French Canadians at the time. Oftentimes, the financial institutions that did exist were owned and operated by Anglo Protestants, who then looked down on French Canadians, this sort of backwards, uneducated, impoverished, crass population, either denying them loans or charging them extreme interest rates, which then led to the Pax Populaire system, which is how credit unions came to the United States, fun facts. But yeah, poor wages, economic stagnation. French Canadians, when they were able to get jobs outside of farms, it was oftentimes for a very poor, low wage that did not offer enough salary to actually advance or save enough to advance, and made it very difficult to And because they were so poor, the people operating these industries, the people directing them, the managers, the owners, the bosses, etc., were able to pay them less and less and less because they were more and more willing to do more for less pay because they didn't have much to begin with. And in order to justify that, the culture and language of French Canadians was increasingly denigrated, portrayed as backwards and undesirable in order to decrease opposition to that, to increase the likelihood that it would continue. And so at the same time, it just so happened that New England as a whole was industrializing at a rapid rate, and French Canadians who did not have much opportunity in Quebec were able to look to New England just right over the border, where oftentimes there was already this experience of working seasonally in the timber trade. They already knew Maine, they already knew New England to some extent oftentimes. They were able to find much better work, significantly higher wage than what they could find in Quebec at the time. The next one, sorry, thank you. Some fun photos here, or at least maybe not the most fun, but child labor. Yeah. Just because it was better than what could be found in Quebec at the time, just because it was a higher wage than what could be found in Quebec at the time, does not mean that it was good work. Does not mean that it was enough of a wage to actually socioeconomically advance definitively into the middle class or even into the upper classes, as oftentimes sold as this American dream, etc. So when French Canadians started emigrating, when they started coming to New England, the Northeast, to work in these small industrial cities, mill work, industrial work was the center of the ethnic neighborhoods, the Petit Canada, in which they lived. Even today, you can still find remnants of these mill buildings in Petit Canada, or at least what was historically Petit Canada would always be around those buildings and the church. And as a very broad brush, it's 60 years between 1870 and the New Deal era, presidency of FDR, the prosperity of World War II, the GI Bill, all kinds of social democratic reforms in the United States, or at least to some extent. We can broadly generalize the labor conditions in this period that French Canadians experienced as characterized by long hours, extremely low pay. Throughout this era, even going into the New Deal era, oftentimes mill workers, at least in the state of Maine, were paid so little that they were oftentimes making between 1/3 to 2/3 of the national average in the country as a whole. They oftentimes lived in tenements and buildings that were poorly managed, that were poorly kept up, that were owned and operated by the same people employing them. So much of their paycheck was just going back to their employers. Oftentimes, at least towards the beginning, the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, it was relatively frequent for mill owners just to pay in script, meaning it wasn't even real money. It was just vouchers that could be redeemable at the company store. So again, all this money, relatively, a significant portion of this paycheck was just being returned to the mill owner, to the employer. And the work itself was dangerous, it was exhausting, it was low status, low income work. As you can see, 1900 in Maine, more than 7% of French Canadians worked in the mills, Franco-Americans worked in the mills, and more than 70% of people working in the mills themselves were themselves French Canadians, Franco-Americans. And again, the same sort of ethnic delineation between Anglo-Protestants who had access to capital, who controlled the means of labor, means of production, versus French Canadians, Franco-Americans who provided a cheap source of labor that was in turn oftentimes exploited because of their poverty. I can go to the next slide, please. And also, in order to sort of justify this, there are widespread ethnic barriers. This, again, the stereotype of this backwards, crass, idiotic, dumb Frenchman, quote unquote. Nativists throughout this period viewed French Canadians as sort of unstoppable tide of this foreign element that was subversive and incapable of integration with the United States, with true Americans, quote unquote, aka Anglo-Saxon English speakers. In the 1890s, rather, the legislature of Maine denied suffrage to anyone who could not read or write in English. Of course, by and large, almost all French Canadians did eventually learn enough to be able to pass the test to be able to vote, but just the fact that it was passed largely in response to French Canadian immigration as itself is telling. That actually wasn't repealed in the 1980s. It is a fun fact. Between 1919 and 1960, infamously, the legislature of Maine banned the use of French in public classrooms. Children caught speaking French would be punished, oftentimes physically or humiliated in front of their classmates. Fun stuff. Also, a fun fact, in 1922, the Supreme Court, in the case of Meyer v. Nebraska, actually ruled such laws unconstitutional. It violated the 14th Amendment. Today, Maine continued to enforce it regardless until 1960, when it was repealed. In 1920s, 1924, Owen Brewster was elected with the explicit support of the Klan. When he was elected, they, again, infamously set up bombs in Lewiston's Petit Canada, burned crosses outside of Franco-American households, businesses, farms, as a way of intimidation. And so you can see there's this shame, stigma, and working class status conflated with Franco-Americans and the French language in Maine, which brings us to our next slide, which is a question. Why was this happening beyond just the idea of there being different people that we don't like? What was the purpose? What was sort of the economic aspect of this discrimination beyond the fact that just French Canadians, Franco-Americans weren't able to access higher status, higher paying jobs because the people who controlled access to those jobs did not like them as people? Why were the mill owners profiting from this perceived low status and undesirability of Franco workers? It again comes back to the fact that if you are poorly paying, poorly treating a class of people that people do not like, it becomes much more justifiable and easier to legitimize your poor treatment of them because they're viewed as incapable of anything more than that, as undeserving as anything more than that. And why was it that working class Anglo-Protestants and also other white ethnic groups such as the Irish, the Italians, etc., oftentimes were so at odds with Franco-Americans in the state? And it comes back to the fact that even though they were all struggling with the same sort of financial powers that were denying them access to higher wages, higher status work, the fact that they could turn to someone else, oftentimes Franco-Americans and Sigmund specifically, looking at them as this sort of, well, at least we aren't like them, it provided this means socially for them to feel better about themselves, even though it bypassed a lot of opportunity for working class solidarity in the state. And so it brings us to the present day. I'm sorry, a little over time, but I'm running. For the next slide as well. From mill closures to the present day, some scenes, closed mills, monuments, oftentimes what people think of when they think, oh yeah, that's the influence of Franco-Americans is no longer necessarily thriving neighborhoods, sort of these place markers of remembrance. The first two major Franco-American, or at least most successful Franco-American politicians, I can show a handful of page. Next slide, please. What were the consequences of these 80 plus years in the mill? 80 plus years of oftentimes being paid so little that you weren't able to save enough to socioeconomically advance. When you had so many children, oftentimes that you weren't able to necessarily dedicate a lot of income to them, of capital to them, when oftentimes, because you were so poor, you've been working in the mill since you were children because it was not economically feasible for you to work in the mill, for you to not work in the mills for your family, because you were being paid so little that you had no choice but to have that extra set of hands bringing in income, which then in turn meant that oftentimes Franco-Americans remained so uneducated, at least in terms of formal education, that higher status, higher paying work later in life was also not possible, and they had to stay in the mill or other similar low status, low paying work. When the mill, sorry. No, you're okay. When the mills did close, even though it was the mills themselves oftentimes that were keeping Franco-Americans, French Canadians in this lower class status, that oftentimes would not advance them beyond manual labor, that oftentimes, again, exploitative pay, not offering enough to advance, not offering enough to go on to even graduate high school, oftentimes let alone college or advanced degrees. When the mills closed, it left entire communities of Franco-Americans without the little security they had, meaning that they had to find work, even though they did not have enough capital to dedicate to finding better work, to receiving specialized skills, to going on to college, to be able to educate themselves, be able to attain higher paying work, meaning that without this experience, without those degrees, they often were just dispersed, when mills did start closing down, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s in the state, into positions that are oftentimes comparable, but less organized in terms of unions and syndicalism. So retail, service work, sanitation, manual labor, construction, etc. Again, low status, low paying. We find that in 1970, 100 years after Francos started coming to the United States, 70% of New England Francos still belong to the working class. And oftentimes young Francos only started graduating from high school, let alone college, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which led to this desire, once they're no longer in these tight ethnic neighborhoods, there's no longer that sense of unity that really kept the culture and language going. It meant that it was easier to sort of abandon these external markers of what made someone a Franco, Anglicization, assimilation. And so it led to this understandable bet, this understandable risk, this bull risk maybe, that if you abandon these external markers, if you abandon this language and this culture, and you gave your children English names, and you distance yourself from the church, and you stop speaking the language, and you stop making touque every Christmas, that you could sort of become a real Anglo, or at least pass as being an Anglo, and the whiteness of French Canadians allowed that assimilation to succeed oftentimes. However, go to the next slide. It did not fully succeed. And although this gap is still decreasing with each generation, the fact that we were only sort of on a level of direct competition economically and socially with Anglo-Protestants in the States starting in the 70s, 80s, 90s even, it meant that Anglo-Protestants in the state had this head start on Franco-Americans in the state for generations and generations, and had the intergenerational familial capital, wealth, knowledge of higher education, knowledge of how to succeed, and the right things to do and the right schools to go to that Franco-Americans just did not have, that still do not have. There's still a lack of Franco presence in prestigious, high status, high paying roles, high status schools. Cities, towns, neighborhoods associated with Franco still viewed as bad areas. Great example is the fact that everyone oftentimes hates Lewiston, but is not really able to articulate why. It's just the fact that they've sort of inherited this prejudice against people living there from their parents, from their grandparents. This idea of the dirty Lou, which is a term that goes back at least to the 70s, which at least initially was denigrating the poor people who lived there, the working class people who lived there, the French Canadians, Franco-Americans lived here, who lived in Lewiston, and which today has, of course, sort of expanded to target recent immigrants from Africa, from different countries. And so it's just progressively becoming more and more racist, which is wonderful. Yeah. Lots of cultural identity, name, and language without really that socioeconomic benefit that people anticipated. Our history and culture is oftentimes largely unrecognized or just flatly unknown by the state, not incorporated in curriculum oftentimes. And even in Franco families, it's this gradual forgetting of what your family went through, of what your cultural self is, which then leads to modern day Francos in turn targeting more recent immigrants as well. Next slide. So just general overview, I'm going to fight through this because I definitely have hit 15 minutes. Initial poverty after centuries of marginalization in Canada, which was then cemented in Maine through decades and decades of low status work and poor wages. It's very difficult for people to earn enough to go to school long enough to be able to advance. Males did not provide that mobility, and thus throughout this entire period until the latter half of the 20th century, many Francos could not even attend high school, let alone college. There's this need to work immediately instead of studying, instead of learning specialized skills, so you could provide your families as soon as possible and address those immediate needs. Lack of familial capital, knowledge, expectation of higher status, and because it was so profitable in the sense that you could pay your workers less, that you could not pay for improvements to their working conditions, it was profitable to portray Franco-Americans, French Canadians as this backward, stupid, uneducated class for as long as possible. And even though oftentimes largely we have anglicized, whatever that might really mean, we are still not on equal footing, at least economically, with Anglo-Protestants in the state. And so, yes, last slide, I promise. Just things to think about. How are you supposed to socioeconomically advance, and the way that oftentimes the United States promises immigrants when you're never paid enough to save money, to get a mortgage, to get a nicer place to live, pay medical bills, pay car bills, etc. When no one's going to hire you because they don't like who you are, at least historically, because of your language, because of your ethnicity, because of your cultural background. When you don't have time to study or learn other skills, when you can't even afford to graduate college or go to college, when oftentimes you haven't even graduated high school, when you had to work that entire time, so dedicating yourself to studies or specialized skills, and when there's no one in your family that you can turn to for help, because no one in your family is ever known. And I think that should at least be the last slide. I think. Yeah, and then Lisa, you're looking at us, so and that's all. Should be.
All right, so So right now, we're going to have a session for Q&A for Timothy.
Excited. I don't know. Yes.
Claire?
So thank you for this wonderful presentation. I'm wondering how you thought of the subject at first. Like, what drove you to think about socioeconomic questions within the community?
I have an answer to this. I think before going to college, I had never really thought about why my family does not have money. I had never really thought of the fact of why certain ethnic groups, certain racial groups, certain religious groups, or just general backgrounds, why some people have more, some people have less. I had always known my family did have a lot, but I never thought anything of it. And I think, like growing up, I had internalized this belief. I think most everyone in this country, to some extent, does internalize as well, that someone's personal or familial wealth is a direct correlation to their hard work, to the fact that they've earned it, and that people who are poor, people who don't have a lot, they're lazy, and they were spending money on things that they need, and instead of being industrious and getting ahead and putting money away, they were foolish with their money. And then going to college, I started seeing other people talking about alternate views by people with money. And I started thinking, I was like, okay, my mom and Pepe were like the hardest working people I know. My single mother, is an incredibly hardworking person. Why do we not have money? Why do we not have wealth? Why did my grandfather go to school when he was, or quit school when he was 12 years old to go work in the mill? And then how were they ever expected to, become wealthy when that was just the circumstances they've been born into? And so I wanted to answer that question and see whether that was a common experience with people of the same background that I knew. I remember sort of like senior year of high school, even like just in my high school in Brunswick, going through school and having this vague inclination that I always loved like talking to the lunch ladies and like the janitors working at the school and like people working the grounds. And it would be fun because they would have last names like Thibault and Theberge and Menard, and they wouldn't say anything like that necessarily, but those were their last names. And then you would go to the people who were actually running the school, people who had the tenured positions in the faculty, and overwhelmingly you would get names like Smith and Thompson and Flanagan and various Anglo or Irish last names. And so that made me think, like, why is it like that? And why is it when I growing up went to mass with my mother, it's like, are you the same memory of like talking with this old lady? I don't remember her name, but she was like having difficulty reading through like a little pamphlet at the church. She didn't really know how to read that well because she'd been working in the mill when she was little. And so there's just sort of wanting to answer that question of why and sort of put a light on something that's not really talked about, which is often just male poverty, because no one wants to talk about the fact that they're not doing well. And just because I feel like it should be talked about, because often it's flatly ignored in curriculum in the state, and just sort of contemporary political commentary. It's like something that happened in the past that has no more ramifications in the future. We're just not know anything in the past words. Is to answer your question in a very long family way. But yes.
Sorry, I'm just really interested in knowing more actually about you, because this was such a great presentation, and I can tell that I'm so happy that this event is happening because it allows everyone to share something really personal. Yeah, so thank you so much for sharing about this, and like your personal story is just like it makes so much sense, really, like hearing why you would make this and be inspired by what you've been through and what you've observed. And I'm wondering, what do you do now? What's the next step for you? Like,
A good question. I graduated from Swarthmore this spring. I'm currently living in Boston, Cambridge, working in Boston. I'm a secretary, watch out. But yeah, for the time being, I just sort of focusing on what exactly it is I do want to do. with my future, because I was thinking for a while, I want to go to law school, or maybe it's just quarantine and I'm going insane in lockdown and don't know how to exist outside of like an big city. And so I'm just, for the time being, I think that is sort of the definitive plan for myself. But yeah, I just like the idea of being able to help people, because oftentimes even in law, it's oftentimes just like targeting poor people, it's targeting ethnic and racial minorities and disadvantaged people. And if someone can like do something to sort of minimize that, if not outright turn it around, at least if it's just like a handful of people, I think it's really important. And it's important, I think, for people like going into law, not that this is necessarily related, I'm sorry, I'm off like a tangent, just to sort of not be there because they're like, oh, this is a way to make lots of money, and I can like sign documents for wealthy people to make them more money at the expense of people.
That's
Yeah.
great. I mean, I would also just like say, it's so cool for me to see like a young Franco-American that knows all this like history and speaks French. It's just so powerful, that representation. So I would really encourage you to just like get as many people to see his presentation as you can. It's really great. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm humbled and blushed.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, hello. So great presentation as well. I concur with Ben, Mickey, and the part comment as well. This is fantastic. And you also make a really persuasive case for the role of economic factors in kind of holding back the potential of this community. As I'm sure you know from your research, like there was a time when people ascribe that to psychological characteristics, like you said, either they're lazy, or if they are working 60 hours a week, that's because they can't manage money, or they're just lacking in ambition. So I kind of want to circle back to the title of your presentation, New Plan Spain, and something that is still heard in Quebec, and it's like the internalization of somebody else's narrative. Have you found in your research that Franco-Americans have kind of internalized those ideas, that like that's something that, without saying that that's holding them back, that they've heard this narrative for so long that it's hard to break out of, this working class ethos, if you will?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I do think that that is definitely present to some extent, especially among older generations. But also for younger generations, I will say in the 2013 contemporary attitudes against Franco-Americans, there was also one note that I thought was odd, or that stuck out to me, is that younger Franco-Americans were disproportionately likely to say that college wasn't worthwhile, that it wasn't worth it to go on, and that it seemed like a waste of time. However, in preparing my research for this, I did several oral history interviews of largely older Franco-Americans, including my great aunt Rose, who passed away this past year. Anyway, but just hearing her speak about it was really powerful, because there was such a sort of resignation to the fact, like, oh yeah, of course, and like she had made her peace with it, and it was something that was just like, this is life, and you don't need a lot, and it was like very devout Catholic, so that she should like kind of found comfort in that, like equal and hair here, all that kind of stuff. But she focused a lot on the fact that even though there wasn't a lot of opportunity, even though there wasn't a lot of money to go around, that didn't necessarily. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to word this well, I'm not succeeding. What I'm trying to say is that there was definitely that attitude that she had, that she expressed, that a lot of older generations also expressed. And just because it was so normal for them, they didn't necessarily see there to be a need to socioeconomically advance. There's a lot of contemporary research from French Canadians first started immigrating that it's amazing how satisfied they are with so little pay. And I think to an extent that was true, because they were used to even less than they were receiving. And so in comparison, things are always nicer, things are worse beforehand, even if the aftermath isn't good. And I think it's just people have oftentimes sort of been resigned to the status of their families. If that, well, my dad didn't go to college, my mom didn't go to college. Like, why do I have to go to college? Like, I could be happy working as a waiter for the rest of my life, and that's wonderful. Like, service work is wonderful if people do sincerely want that for themselves. When it's a question of if there are no other options but to, be in, unorganized, low-paying, low-status work because you still have capital to life. I think there needs to be sort of among Franco-American sort of a recognition that it doesn't have to be like that, even if it's sort of the expectation with which we're born. And last point on that, sorry, I'm really just going off. I also think that it's not even I think it just like is flatly like extremely beneficial for children when from early childhood onwards to sort of inculcate this expectation that they're going to do better and that they're going to make it and they're going to succeed in college. I mean, if that is in fact what they want, because I mean, so many studies demonstrate that children encouraged, if these expectations are set and just expected of them from an early age, they are more likely to succeed. There's never really a question of confidence and this worrying of if you're the first generation of your family to go to college, before you're doing applications, like why should I even go? Why do I need to go? I'm down. I'm not worthwhile to go to college, let alone a quote unquote college. Yeah, and so I think that again, I think for early childhood onwards, even if it's not sort of the familial pattern up until that generation institution.
All right, so that's all the time we have for questions for Timothy.